combination of both tax administrative measures and tax policy reforms. Mr. Speaker, regarding tax policy, the government will implement the national tax policy and finalize the medium-term revenue strategy for the period financial year 2023-2024 to 2026-2027. The national tax policy, which is before this House, will enhance the administrative efficiency of the tax system, provide consistency and certainty in tax registration and management of tax expenditures. The medium-term revenue strategy comprises legal, administrative, and policy measures to reform the tax system, which is expected to boost tax revenue over the medium term. On tax administration, Mr. Speaker, the Kenya Revenue Authority is implementing reforms to move towards seamless taxation by ensuring that its systems, taxpayers, and businesses are integrated to allow for the automatic movement of data through machine-to-machine based processes, and where appropriate, shift to real-time processing. This will enable KRA to monitor business transactions in real time, therefore sealing revenue leakages through tax avoidance and evasion. On the expenditure reforms, Mr. Speaker, the government will sustain efforts to improve efficiency in public spending and ensure value for money by eliminating non-priority expenditures, retiring expenditure and unsustainable consumption subsidies, reducing tax exemption, scaling up use of public-private partnership financing for commercially viable projects, and rolling out end-to-end procurement system. Mr. Speaker, to address the challenges of perennial low absorption of development partners' funds that have denied Kenyans the full benefit of this financing, the government will put in place policies and administrative measures to minimize payments of unnecessary fees and charges. Let me turn to revenue projections, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, supported by the tax policy reforms and administrative measures highlighted above, we project total revenue corrections, including appropriations in aid and grants for the financial year 2023-2024 budget to be Kenya shillings 2.96 trillion, and that is equivalent to 18.2% of gross domestic product, GDP. Of this, ordinary revenue is projected at Kenya shillings 2.57 trillion, equivalent to 15.8% of GDP. Ministerial appropriations in aid is projected at Kenya shillings 348.7 billion, and grants are projected at Kenya shillings 42.2 billion. Expenditure projections, Mr. Speaker. Total expenditure projections in financial year 2023-2024 budget is projected at 3.7 trillion, equivalent to 22.6% of GDP. Of these, recurrent expenditures will amount to Kenya shillings 2.53 trillion, equivalent to 15.6% of GDP. Development expenditures, including allocation to domestic and foreign financed project, contingency fund, equalization fund, and conditional capital transfers to county government, is Kenya shillings 743 billion, equivalent to 4.7% of GDP. Equitable share to county governments is projected at that 385.4 billion shillings. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to fiscal balance. Mr. Speaker, given the projected revenue and grants against the projected expenditures, the fiscal gap of fiscal deficit is projected to decline from Kenya shillings 718.0 billion, equivalent to 4.4% of GDP in financial year 2023-2024, from a projected Kenya shillings 840.9 billion, equivalent to 5.8% of GDP in financial year 2023-2023. The fiscal deficit would be financed through net external financing of Kenya shillings 1.5 billion, equivalent to 0.8% of GDP, and net domestic financing of 586.5 billion, and that is equivalent to 3.6% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, our medium-term fiscal consolidation policy targets to progressively reduce the level of fiscal deficit from the expected 5.8% of GDP in financial year 2022-2023 to 3.6% of GDP in the financial year 2026 to 2027. Let me turn to public debt management, Mr. Speaker. Kenya's public debt remains sustainable, but with elevated risks of debt distress due to persistent global shocks that adversely affect the liquidity ratios. The depreciation of the Kenya shilling against major currencies and the rise of interest rates have elevated cost of debt service. Further, the depreciation of the currency has increased the size of the public debt stock, as half of the public debt is actually denominated in foreign currency. Although the debt burden has risen, Kenya has not accumulated debt service arrears, and the government is committed to honor all public debt obligations as they fall due. Over the medium term, revenue-driven fiscal consolidation policy stance is expected to improve further the country's debt sustainability ratios and debt carrying capacity. Mr. Speaker, the current limit of the debt as approved in 2020 by this House is Kenya shillings 10 trillion. Guided by the best practice, the government intends to change the public debt ceiling from a numerical number to a debt anchor in the form of a ratio of public debt to GDP in present value terms. The proposed change to the debt ceiling provides an appropriate guide for optimal level of public debt based on the country's ability to pay. This is the debt carrying capacity that can objectively be assessed, as well as provide directions on information on debt accumulation or reduction from time to time. In order to anchor debt ceiling in a statute, the National Treasury developed a Public Finance Management Amendment Bill 2023, which has been submitted to this august House for enactment. The bill was subjected to public participation in line with the requirements of the Constitution of Kenya on transparency and accountability in public policy formulation. I urge the honorable members to prioritize and consider this bill favorably. Mr. Speaker, the external debt service is projected to increase to Kenya shillings 475.6 billion in financial year 2023-2024 from Kenya shillings 242.1 billion in the financial year 2023, for financial year 2022-2023, mainly reflecting redemption of the US dollar 2.0 billion Eurobond, which is approximately 241.8 billion with the current exchange rate. In preparation for the redemption of this maturing bond, the National Treasury and the Economic Planning issued an expression of interest to bring on board a lead manager to advise the government on liability management options towards the resolution of the Eurobond 2024. Mr. Speaker, I wish to assure Kenyans and investors that our fiscal positions remain strong and the government remains committed to meet all maturing obligations as and when they fall due, including the maturing Eurobond for June 2024. Mr. Speaker, due to the limited fiscal space, the government has strengthened the public-private partnership (PPP) framework to leverage on private sector expertise to deliver projects that have strong economic, commercial, and environmental benefits that are also aligned to our national priorities with sustainability and climate change as key considerations and drivers. To ensure the sustainability of PPP projects, the Projects Facilitation Fund, PFF, has been operationalized. The fund will support project preparation, provide viability gap funding to projects, as well as a source of liquidity to meet fiscal commitments and contingent liabilities that may arise from PPP projects. Mr. Speaker, with the fund in place and the robust legal and regulatory regime, the private sector has the necessary confidence and security to invest in PPP projects. Indeed, in the last financial year, the National Treasury successfully mobilized Kenya shillings 15 billion by achieving financial closure of 2 clusters of urban roads projects under the Roads Annuity Program. The projects are currently in the construction phase. Additional projects that have closed include 2 renewable energy projects with a combined installed capacity of 70 megawatts. Further, to contribute towards government's agenda on bulk water supply and food security, several high-impact projects have been appraised and approved to proceed to the project development phase under the PPP model. These projects will provide production of additional 51,000 hectares to further strengthen the food security agenda, which is a high priority for the Kenya Kwanza administration. The bulk of water will increase potable water. The bulk water will increase potable water supply by an estimated 200,000 cubic meters per day. The National Treasury and the Ministry of Water and Sanitation have developed a water purchase agreement which will pave way for the private sector to develop projects in a sustainable way. The National Treasury is in the process of developing a 10-year infrastructure plan that will be cross-cutting across various ministries to support delivery and prioritization of projects. Mr. Speaker, to build on this, the National Treasury plans to mobilize an estimated Kenya shillings 100 billion in private sector capital through various priority sectors. The focus will be on priority investment and underlying key projects and programs in each sector that deliver nationally significant infrastructure drive growth and also unlock private sector investment with greatest potential benefits to Kenyans. These sectors will include airports, seaports, blue economy, water, agriculture, industrialization, that is special economic zones, energy, including transmission lines, and digitalization, among other key sectors in the economy. Inclusion of local goods, works, and services will be emphasized for each project to contribute to overall economic growth by encouraging local investments in PPP projects. To also strengthen local investment, the National Treasury will be holding a series of roundtables to build local capacity in the financial sector so as to increase local financing of PPP projects. The National Treasury has embraced the climate resilience and adaptation framework for public-private partnership projects. This is to ensure that infrastructure projects are aligned to the realities of climate change. To achieve on the PPP mandate of scaling up private sector capital, the National Treasury will leverage on the continued support from development partners as well as other key institutions both in public and private sector, including capital markets, pension funds and commercial banks, in scaling up the private sector capital under the PPP framework. Let me turn to public investments management. Mr. Speaker, in 2022, the House approved Public Investment Management (PIM) regulations 2022. The objectives of the regulations is to provide the national and county governments and their entities with a standardized approach in project cycle management to enhance transparency, accountability, prudent use of public resources, and public participation. The government will continue implementing the regulations to enhance efficiency in identification and implementation of priority socio and economic investment projects. This will further curtail runaway project costs, eliminate duplication, and improve working synergy among implementation actors for timely delivery and development of the development projects. In the financial year 2023-2024, the National Treasury will develop and roll out the Public Investment Management Information System, PIMIS or PIMIS. It automates public investments management processes as outlined in the regulations to ensure that only projects with highest socio-economic returns are undertaken and prioritized for completion. Let me turn to resource allocation under the bottom-up economic transformation agenda. Mr. Speaker, the highlights of the budget allocation in the coming financial year are provided in recognition of the need to restrain borrowing and utilize the revenues and grants projected and in the fiscal framework. The proposed total programmed expenditures spending for the financial year 2023-2024 has been capped at 3.68 trillion. The bottom-up economic transformation agenda, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, the government will implement strategic priorities under the bottom-up economic transformation agenda that is geared towards economic turnaround and inclusive growth. The agenda focuses on 5 sectors that have been outlined, and they have been outlined because they give the largest impact to the economy as well as households, as well as raise the household's welfare. This includes, for purposes of repeating, agricultural transformation, micro, small and medium enterprise economy, housing and settlements, healthcare, digital superhighway, and creative industry. Mr. Speaker, to ensure the effectiveness and efficiency in the planned investment in the 5 sectors, Kenya Kwanza administration has adopted the value chain approach to budgeting. In this regard, the government has identified 9 key value chain areas for implementation, namely leather, cotton, dairy, edible oils, tea, rice, blue economy, natural resources including minerals and forestry, and building materials. This will ensure that there is no break in the value chain, there is no break in the cycle of resource allocation for value chain and that in the value chain, and that adequate resources are allocated to the entities along the value chain. And of importance, Mr. Speaker, this will eliminate any form of duplication of both roles and budgeting to ensure that there are no gaps and thus ensure efficiency in resource allocation. Agricultural transformation and inclusive growth, Mr. Speaker, the government will implement interventions to ensure food security in the country through climate change, mitigation and adaptation, thereby reducing the cost of living. As part of the country's long-term food security plan, the government, working with private sector, will continue to subsidize fertilizer in order to make it available and improve productivity in counties. This intervention is also aimed at creating jobs, as agriculture has the highest employment multiplier effect owing to its strong forward and backward linkages to other sectors of the economy. Mr. Speaker, in order to support our aspiration to the National Assembly to effect budget allocations of Kenya shillings 49.9 billion to relevant programs in this budget. Out of this, 5 billion shillings is proposed for fertilizer subsidy program, 8.6 billion for the National Agricultural Value Chain Development Project, 2.7 billion for the National Agricultural and Rural Inclusivity Projects, 2.1 billion for the Kenya Cereal Enhancement Program, 2.8 billion for the Emergency Locust Response, 1.4 billion for small-scale irrigation and value addition programs, 1.3 billion on food production and nutrition security program, 500 million for agricultural sector development support program, and 596 million for the food security and crop diversification projects. Mr. Speaker, to improve livestock production, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 3.7 billion to de-risking, inclusion and value enhancement of pastoral economies program. Kenya shillings 2.1 billion for livestock value chain support project, Kenya shillings 1.5 billion for Kenya livestock commercialization program, and Kenya shillings 166 million for the embryo transfer project. I also propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 350 million for the development of the leather industrial park at Kinani, Kenya shillings 220 million for livestock production, and Kenya shillings 132 million for leather value chain. To enhance animal disease control, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocations of Kenya shillings 130 million for sustainable sesify and trypanosomiasis-free areas in Kenya, and Kenya shillings 135 for the establishment of liquid nitrogen hydrogen. Mr. Speaker, the realization of food and nutrition security also relies heavily on the sustainable utilization of the blue economy, resources. To promote this, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 2.6 billion for the acquisition for the aquaculture business development projects, Kenya shillings 3.5 billion for Kenya marine fisheries and socio-economic development projects, Kenya shillings 1.2 billion for marine fish stock assessment, Kenya shillings 580 million for capacity building in deep sea fishing, Kenya shillings 142 million for the rehabilitation of fish landing sites in Lake Victoria, Kenya shillings 141.5 million for the aquaculture technology development and innovations transfer, Kenya shillings 500.7 million for Liwatoni Ultra Modern Fish Hub, and Kenya shillings 88 million for the development of the blue economy initiatives. Mr. Speaker, in order to increase agricultural productivity and enhance the resilience to climate change risks in targeted smallholder farming and pastoral communities in Kenya, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocations of Kenya shillings 1.5 billion for climate smart agriculture productivity project, Kenya shillings 625 million to enhance drought resilience and sustainable livelihood program, Kenya shillings 318 million towards adding drought emergencies in Kenya project. In addition, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocations of Kenya shillings 300 for the crop insurance scheme to reduce the vulnerabilities of Kenya farmers to disease and natural disasters. Mr. Speaker, to ensure legitimacy of RAD ownership, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 1.2 billion for processing and registration of title deeds, Kenya shillings 2.6 billion for the settlement of the RAD race, Kenya shillings 755 million for digitization, Kenya shillings 755 million for digitization of RAD registries, and Kenya shillings 138.3 million for the construction of RAD registries. Mr. Speaker, transforming the macro, small and medium enterprises, MSME economy. Mr. Speaker, this is going to help us and to tackle the key bottlenecks of MSMEs on limited access to credit. The government rolled out in November 2022 Financial Inclusion Fund, popularly known as the Hustlers Fund, with an initial target budget of 20 billion shillings in the current financial year. As an intervention to correct market failure problems at the bottom of the pyramid. This program aims to lift those at the bottom of the pyramid through structured products in personal finance that includes savings, credit, insurance, and investment. This, together with other affirmative action funds like the Youth Enterprise Fund, Women Enterprise Fund, WESO Fund, and MSME's Credit Guarantee Scheme, will increase access to affordable credit to targeted persons and sectors, and thereby increase their investment and allow for private sector-led growth. To further support MSMEs, women and the youth of this country, I propose to the National Assembly to effect an additional budget allocation of Kenya shillings 10 billion towards the Hustlers Fund, Kenya shillings 300 million to SMEs in the manufacturing sector, Kenya shillings 182.8 million for Women Enterprise Fund, Kenya shillings 175 for Youth Enterprise Fund, Enterprise and Development Fund, and Kenya shillings 192 million to WESO Fund. This allocation will inevitably guarantee access to affordable credit to the hustlers, households, MSMEs, and therefore accord them an opportunity to make their rightful contribution to nation building. Let me turn to housing and settlement. Mr. Speaker, the cost of housing is a heavy burden to the majority of Kenyans, and is the main factor driving the proliferation of slums in the country. The government's commitment is to turn the housing challenge into an economic opportunity to create quality jobs for our over 100,000 young people graduating from TVETs every year, directly in the construction sector, and also indirectly through the production of building products. This will be achieved through, among others, facilitating the delivery of 250,000 houses per annum and enabling affordable housing mortgages. To ensure success of this initiative, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of 35.2 billion for the housing program. This includes 7.3 billion under the Kenya Urban Program, KENAP, Kenya shillings 5.5 billion to Kenya Mortgage Refinance Company for enhancement of the company's capital, as well as for on-lending to primary mortgage lenders, Kenya shillings 3.2 billion for construction of affordable housing units, as well as Kenya shillings 3.3 billion for the construction of social housing units. Other key proposed allocations to the housing, urban development and public works sector includes shillings 5.5 billion for the Kenya Informal Settlement Improvement Project Phase 2, Kenya shillings 5.2 billion for the construction of markets, Kenya shillings 932 million to the maintenance of government pool houses, Kenya shillings 1.1 billion for the construction of housing units for the National Police and Kenya prisons, Kenya shillings 637 million for the Kenya municipal programs, and Kenya shillings 150 million for the construction of footbridges, and Kenya shillings 300 million for the development of appropriate building technology. Enhancing the quality and affordable health care. Mr. Speaker, the Kenya Kwanza administration is committed and determined to realize the constitutional right to health in the shortest time period by delivering a universal health care coverage USA system. This entails promoting access to quality and affordable health care through the Universal Healthcare Coverage Program. Towards this end, Mr. Speaker, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 141.2 billion to the health sector to support various programs aimed at supporting universal health care coverage. Mr. Speaker, specific proposed allocation for the various activities and programs include Kenya shillings 18.4 billion for the universal health care coverage, Kenya shillings 3.7 billion for the Kenya COVID-19 Emergency Response Project, Kenya shillings 4.1 billion for free maternity health care, Kenya shillings 5.9 billion for the managed equipment services, as well as managed equipment services MES, as well as Kenya shillings 1.7 billion to provide medical cover for the elderly and severely disabled persons in our society. Mr. Speaker, to lower cases of HIV/AIDS, malaria and tuberculosis in the economy, Kenya shillings 24.8 billion is proposed at a global fund, and Kenya shillings 4.6 billion to enhance vaccines and immunization program. Mr. Speaker, to promote early diagnosis and management of cancer and reduce the burden of treatment among Kenyans, I propose to the National Assembly to effect a budget allocation of Kenya shillings 1.9 billion for construction of cancer center at Kisii Level 5 Hospital, Kenya shillings 500 for strengthening of cancer center management at Kenyatta National Hospital, and an additional Kenya shillings 155 million is proposed for the establishment of regional cancer centers. Further, to improve the health service delivery, I propose to the National Assembly to effect a budget allocation of 21.6 billion for Kenyatta National Hospital, Kenya shillings 12.8 billion for the Moi Teaching and Referral Hospital, Kenya shillings 8.8 billion for the Kenya Medical Training Colleges, Kenya shillings 3.3 billion for the Kenya Medical Research Institute, Kenya shillings 2.4 billion for the construction of the Kenya National Hospital Burns and Pediatric Centers, Kenya shillings 1.4 billion for the equipping of laboratories and classrooms of KMTC, Kenya shillings 1.1 billion for the renovation of Kenyatta National Hospital, Kenya shillings 1 billion for the procurement of family planning and reproductive health commodities, Kenya shillings 1 billion for the procurement of equipment for the National Blood Transfusion Service, and Kenya shillings 352 million for the digital health platform. A mid-term to digital superhighway and creative economy, Mr. Speaker, the digital superhighway will play a critical role in enabling the government to achieve the objectives of bottom-up economic transformation agenda, as well as in enhancing revenue collection via automation of VAT systems. Digitalization and automation will increase productivity and competitiveness through providing quick access to the market and reducing information asymmetry, as well as improving risk management. Promotion of music, theater, graphic design, digital animation, fashions, and craft, among others, will increase employment for the youth. Mr. Speaker, the implementation of these interventions is expected to stimulate economic recovery, while at the same time securing sustainable and inclusive growth amidst emerging challenges. But more importantly, improve the quality of growth from the public sector investment-led growth to a dynamic private sector-led growth. To achieve these aspirations, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 15.1 billion to fund initiatives in the information, communication, and technology sector. Specifically, Mr. Speaker, this proposed allocation includes 600 million for the government shared services to fast-track the development of the Concert Technopolis city. I propose the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 4.8 billion for the horizontal infrastructure phase 1, Kenya shillings 1.2 billion for Concert data center and smart city facilities, and Kenya shillings 475 million for construction of Konza Complex Phase 1B. Mr. Speaker, other proposed allocations include 5.7 billion shillings for the construction of the Kenya Advanced Institute of Science and Technology at Konza Technopolis, Kenya shillings 1.3 billion for maintenance and rehabilitation of the National Optic Fiber Backbone Phase 2 expansion cable, and Kenya shillings 583 million for the maintenance and rehabilitation of the last mile county connectivity network. Mr. Speaker, having highlighted expenditures under the 5 priority sector areas of the bottom-up economic transformation agenda, I now turn to other proposed areas of expenditure in this budget that will support our path towards sustainable and resilient economic growth trajectory. First, let me turn to investing in critical infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, the government will continue to expand critical infrastructure in roads, railways, sea and airports to create an enabling environment for economic recovery and employment creation. Towards this end, high quality in our education system so as to level the playing field for all children irrespective of their background. Mr. Speaker, to improve the education outcomes in the country, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 628.6 billion to the education sector. Out of the proposed allocation, Kenya shillings 12.5 billion will cater for the free primary education, Kenya shillings 65.4 billion for the free day secondary education, including insurance under NHIF for secondary school students, Kenya shillings 25.5 billion for junior secondary school capitation, Kenya shillings 5 billion to support examinations fee waiver, Kenya shillings 4.8 billion for recruitment of 20,000 intern teachers, Kenya shillings 1 billion for the promotion of teachers, Kenya shillings 4.9 billion for the school feeding program, and Kenya shillings 940 million for the provision of sanitary towels. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 1.3 billion for training of teachers on competency-based curriculum, and Kenya shillings 400 million for the digital literacy program and ICT integration in our secondary schools. To support infrastructure development and ensure safe learning in schools, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocations of Kenya shillings 6 billion for primary school and secondary schools infrastructure, including classrooms for junior secondary schools, and Kenya shillings 1.9 billion for construction and equipment of technical training institutes and vocational training centers. Further, 1.8 billion is proposed to increase access. Kenya shillings 30.3 billion for the Higher Education Loans Board, Kenya shillings 2.7 billion for Kenya Secondary Education Quality Improvement Project, and Kenya shillings 5.2 billion capitation for TVET students. Mr. Speaker, Kenya shillings 980 million is proposed for technical vocational education training and entrepreneurship. Kenya shillings 1.5 billion for promotion of youth employment and vocational training, and 749 million for the research, science and technology and innovation. Let me move now to supporting manufacturing for job creation. Mr. Speaker, in order to improve productivity in the manufacturing sector, as earlier indicated, the government has adopted a value chain approach through bottom-up economic transformation agenda. This will address bottlenecks that impede the growth of the manufacturing sector in order to create jobs and enhance the economy's competitiveness. To further promote local industries, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 26.9 billion under the various implementing ministries, departments and agencies. Out of this allocation, 4.7 billion will support establishment of county integrated agro-industrial parks. Kenya shillings 3 billion for construction of 6 export processing zones flagship projects. Kenya shillings 3.1 billion for supporting access to finance and enterprise recovery project. Kenya shillings 500 million for the development of special economic zones textile park in Naivasha, and Kenya shillings 1.8 billion for the construction of an effluent treatment plant at Kenaini. In addition, Mr. Speaker, in order to maximize the benefits from our cash crop, the government will make further investment towards the revival of and enhancement of output. In this respect, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation to the revitalization of the cash crops. Kenya shillings 120 million for cotton, Kenya shillings 62 million for coconut, Kenya shillings 35 million for cashew nut, and Kenya shillings 150 million for pyrethrum. Mr. Speaker, I also propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 100 million for the modernization of cooperative cotton ginneries. Kenya shillings 134 million for the National Edible Oils Crop Promotion Project, and Kenya shillings 270 million for Sugar Reforms Support Project. Mr. Speaker, to equip the youth with essential internship opportunities, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 1.5 billion for the Kenya Industry Entrepreneurship Project. The Kenya Industry and Entrepreneurship Project. Kenya shillings 300 million for the Kenya Youth Employment and Opportunities Project. Kenya shillings 332 million for the construction of industrial research laboratories, and Kenya shillings 182.9 million for the constituency industrial development centers. In addition, improving security, Mr. Chairman, the security is critical for creating a safe environment for the investment and protection of our citizens and their property. For this reason, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocations for Kenya shillings 338.2 billion to support operations of the Kenya Defence Forces, the National Police Service, the National Intelligence Service, and the prison services. Mr. Speaker, the proposed allocation include 144.9 billion for the Kenya Defence Forces, Kenya shillings 98.6 billion for the National Police Service, Kenya shillings 44.3 billion for the National Intelligence Service, and Kenya shillings 31.3 billion for prison services. I have also proposed Kenya shillings 8.8 billion for the leasing of police motor vehicles. Mr. Speaker, for better equip the National Police Service, I have proposed an initial allocation of Kenya shillings 500 million for the police modernization program. Mr. Speaker, I will later be requesting this august House for enhanced funding approval once the ongoing discussions on a comprehensive police modernization program once it is concluded. In addition, Mr. Speaker, to step up war on crime and enhance support to administration of justice, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 856 million to equip the National Forensic Laboratory. Mr. Speaker, the improvement of the welfare of our disciplined forces is at the center of the Kenya Kwanza administration. To improve housing accommodation for our defense forces, we shall fast track the delivery of staff houses through public-private partnership framework. We have already around Kenya Defense Forces to retain Kenya shillings 534 million currently collected from rental income and apply it towards repayment for the houses once complete. In addition, Mr. Speaker, as you are aware, His Excellency the President appointed a task force to review the terms and conditions of police, prisons, and national youth service. We shall be presenting a funding proposal to this House once the discussions are concluded and adopted within the government. Mr. Speaker, other proposed allocations include 2.9 billion for group personal insurance for police and prison services and Kenya shillings 5.8 billion for medical insurance for police and prison services. Mr. Speaker, I move now to protecting the vulnerable groups. Mr. Speaker, at the heart of the government's development agenda is the inclusion in society and employment opportunities for the vulnerable groups, vulnerable members of the society. In this regard, I propose to the National Assembly to effect a budget allocation of Kenya shillings 38.2 billion for the social protection and affirmative actions in this budget. Out of this proposed allocation, Kenya shillings 18 billion will cater for cash transfers to elderly persons, Kenya shillings 7.9 billion for the orphans and vulnerable children, and Kenya shillings 1.2 billion for persons living with severe disabilities. Mr. Speaker, to ensure the elderly and other vulnerable groups under the cash transfer program do not take long waiting for their cash payment and cash transfers will be prioritized and paid alongside the monthly government payroll as and when it is due. Mr. Speaker, the proposed allocation for the vulnerable group members of our society also includes 5.6 billion for the Kenya Hunger Safety Net program, Kenya shillings 3.3 billion for Kenya Social and Economic Inclusion Project. In addition, Kenya shillings 900 million will go to Child Welfare Society of Kenya, Kenya shillings 400 million for the Presidential Bursary for the orphans, and Kenya shillings 459 million for the National Development Fund for persons living with disabilities. These allocations shall remain ring-fenced from any budget rationalization and will be fully funded in order to achieve the desired results. Let me turn to equity, poverty reduction, women and youth empowerment programs. Mr. Speaker, the most pressing challenge in our country at the moment is lack of job opportunities for the youth. This has been exacerbated by the hard economic times following several negative shocks explained earlier in the statement. In order to empower the youth and support businesses owned by youth and women, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 81.9 billion for these initiatives. The proposed allocations include 13.1 billion for the National Youth Service, Kenya shillings 602 million for the Kenya Youth Empowerment and Opportunities Project, Kenya shillings 300 million for the establishment of youth empowerment centers, Kenya shillings 229.7 million to implement the Vijana Vuka na Avya, that is Viva Youth Program. To support the film industry, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocations of 100 million to strengthen the film industry in Kenya, Kenya shillings 49 million for film location mapping, and Kenya shillings 100 million for the Kenya Film School. Mr. Speaker, women participation in the key sectors of our economy is critical for the economy. For this reason, the government will sustain increased incomes for women through employment creation and supporting women-led enterprises. We will further strengthen women participation in decision-making in our governance and political institutions, as well as reduce sexual and gender-based violence provision of affordable houses, affordable health services. To further empower our women, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 245 million to strengthen prevention and response to gender-based violence in Kenya. Kenya shillings 3.0 billion, Kenya shillings 3 billion for the national government affirmative for the Kenya Government Affirmative Action Fund. Mr. Speaker, to promote global equity, reduce poverty, and embrace social development, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocations of Kenya shillings 53.5 billion for the National Government Constituency Development Fund, as well as 10.9 billion for the Equalization Fund to finance programs in previously marginalized areas. Let me turn to stimulating tourism, growth, sports, culture, and recreation and arts. Mr. Speaker, the government has prioritized sports, culture, and recreation. I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 12.5 billion. This includes an allocation of 6.4 billion under the Sports, Arts, Social Development Fund, Kenya shillings 4.1 billion for the Tourism Fund, and Kenya shillings 2 billion for the Tourism Promotion Fund. Let me turn to environmental protection, water, and natural resources. Mr. Speaker, environmental conservation and response to the impacts of climate change are the center of government's socio-economic transformation agenda. To expand access to clean and adequate water for domestic and agricultural use, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 43.3 billion for water sewerage infrastructure development, Kenya shillings 12.4 billion for water resources management, Kenya shillings 1.6 billion for water storage and flood control. In addition, I propose 19.7 billion for irrigation and land reclamation, and now 1.9 billion for water harvesting and storage for irrigation. Mr. Speaker, in order to support the environment and water conservation and respond to climate change, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 14.4 billion for forests and water towers conservation, Kenya shillings 3.8 billion for environment management and protection, Kenya shillings 3.6 billion for the Kenya financing locally led climate action project, 1.5 billion for meteorological services. In addition, I have proposed an allocation of 1.1 billion for human wildlife conflict compensation, Kenya shillings 800 million for wildlife insurance, Kenya shillings 400 million for maintenance of access road and airstrips in parks, Kenya shillings 319 million for drilling of boreholes in protected areas for provision of water for wildlife, and 226 million for wildlife research facilities. Let me turn to improving governance, sustaining the fight against corruption. Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to scale up the implementation of the provisions of the 2010 Constitution, strengthen the rule of law, increase access to justice, and ensure respect of human rights. Mr. Speaker, to enhance good governance and scale up fight against corruption, I propose to the National Assembly to effect the budget allocation of Kenya shillings 3.9 billion for Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, Kenya shillings 3.6 billion for the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, Kenya shillings 8 billion for the criminal investigation services, and Kenya shillings 8.0 billion for the Office of the Auditor General. In addition, to embrace the oversight and legislative role of Parliament and access to justice, I propose to the National Assembly to effect budget allocation of Kenya shillings 41 billion for the Parliament and Kenya shillings 23.2 billion for the judiciary. Completion of planned projects, Mr. Speaker, in order to ensure the value for money and timely realization of budgets of benefits accruing from budgetary allocation and implementation of planned projects, ministries, departments, and agencies have identified projects for completion in the course of the financial year. The projects will be fast-tracked and protected from any adjustment. The National Assembly is requested to support this endeavor as this is consistent with the resolution of this House. Transfer of national government to county governments, Mr. Speaker. The county governments will receive a proposed allocation of 385.4 billion as equitable share of the financial year 2023-2024. This is 23% of the financial year 2019-2020 shareable revenue, which is the most recent audited and approved revenue by the National Assembly. This is above the minimum threshold required under Article 203, Section 2 of the Constitution. In addition, the county equitable share, the county governments will receive additional conditional and unconditional allocations amounting to 56.7 billion. This brings total allocation to the county governments in the financial year 2023-2024 to Kenya shillings 442.1 billion. Part of this include 425 million for the transfer of library services being a devolved function. Kenya shillings 2.9 billion as outstanding mineral royalties share to 32 county governments as stipulated in the Mining Act 2016, a consolidated grant of 100 million Kenya shillings per county for the aggregated industrial parks program, which is meant to assist the farmers in the value addition and market access for their products. Let me turn to Equalization Fund, Mr. Speaker. In line with the Article 2004, Section 1 of the Constitution of Kenya, Kenya shilling 7.9 billion has been allocated under the Equalization Fund in the financial year 2023-2024. This represents 0.5% of the financial year 2019-2020 revenue, which is the most recent audited and approved revenue by the National Assembly. Mr. Speaker, in addition to this, we have allocated 3 billion to cater for part arrears for the previous years, bringing the total allocation of the Equalization Fund to 10.9 billion shillings. Let me turn to transfer of functions between national government and county governments. Mr. Speaker, the National Treasury and Economic Planning, in collaboration with the Council of Governors and other institutions, developed a draft registration to operationalize Article 187 and Article 189 of the Constitution. This is on transfer of functions and cooperation between national and county governments and amongst county governments themselves. The proposed registration has gone through public participation with the county government executives, county assemblies, development partners, among others. Mr. Speaker, I will shortly submit the bill for the cabinet approval and onward transmission to Parliament. Let me turn to measures to enhance county government's own source revenue. Mr. Speaker, the National Treasury and Economic Planning, State Department of Lands, Council of Governors, and other stakeholders have developed the National Rating Bill 2022, which went through the first reading on 8 March 2023 in the National Assembly, and thereafter was submitted to the National Assembly Committee on Lands. The bill provides, among others, standards in the way rating and evaluation is conducted in the country, how to deal with the properties cross-cutting in more than one county government, procedures for claiming and payment of contribution of real of rates, and timely updating of valuation laws by the county governments. More importantly, the bill will repeal the outdated Valuation for Rating Act Cap 266 and Rating Act Cap 267 and align property rating legal regime with the devolved system of governance. Our appeal to the House is to consider and fast-track this bill to unlock revenue potential to the county governments from property taxation as it was envisaged in Article 203, Section 3. Let me turn to sharing of mineral royalties revenue. Mr. Speaker, Mining Act 2016 assigns 70% of the mineral royalties collected from mining companies to the national government, 20% to county governments, and 10% to communities. Since 2016, county governments and communities have not received their share of these royalties. To address this matter, I have submitted a framework for sharing 2.9 billion shillings among 32 county governments for mineral royalties outstanding as of 30th June 2022 for consideration and approval by the Parliament. Mr. Speaker, during the Intergovernmental Budget and the Economic Council (IBEC) 17th Ordinary Session held on 31st May 2022, IBEC considered and adopted a report and a framework for sharing of funds arising from contravention of county government registration. In the next financial year, the National Treasury has proposed Kenya shillings 108 million to be shared among the beneficiaries of county governments. Mr. Speaker, enhancement of county government has its own challenges. One of such challenges is multiplicity of fees and charges imposed by county governments that increase the cost of doing business and negatively impacts on our competitiveness as a country. Some county governments have imposed charges in a way that prejudices national economic policies, economic activities across county boundaries, or the national mobility of goods, services, capital, and even labor. As a result, the National Treasury and Economic Planning has been receiving a lot of complaints from the ministries, departments, state agencies, and the private sector relating to the uncoordinated manner in which counties are imposing multiple fees and charges. Mr. Speaker, some neighboring countries have also complained that some of the charges imposed by the county governments are against the East African Community Customs Management Act and East African Community Common Markets Protocol and may result in retaliatory measures and trade disruptions between Kenya and other partner states in the East African community. To address these issues, the National Treasury and Economic Planning has resubmitted the county government's revenue raising process bill of 2023 to Parliament for consideration and enactment. I urge this House to expedite the enactment of this bill in order to promote the competitiveness of our country in doing business and open up the country for investment. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to taxation measures. Mr. Speaker, I will now turn to 2024 budget. I will begin by highlighting the key measures on customs duty as agreed by the ministers responsible for finance and economic affairs in the East African Community during the pre-budget consultation meeting that was held in Arusha in May 2023. Mr. Speaker, during the East African Community pre-budget consultations meeting, the ministers noted the significant contribution of manufacturing sector to job creation and economic growth in the region. The ministers therefore agreed on measures to prevent the proliferation of cheap imports into the region so as to protect local manufacturers from unfair competition and enable them to access raw materials and inputs at affordable prices. Mr. Speaker, the agreed custom measures shall become effective from 1st July 2023. Mr. Speaker, one of the success stories of the East African Community is the establishment of the East African Customs Union as a single customs territory. In order to streamline importation of goods into the customs territory, the East African region completed the comprehensive review of the Common External Tariff, CET, and this has been under implementation from 1st July 2022. The revised tariff has a 4 tariff band structure compared with the earlier 3 tariff band structure. In the new structure, raw materials, that is, as well as inputs and capital goods, are imported duty-free. Intermediate goods are imported at a rate of 10%, while finished goods, which are not available in the region, are imported at a 25% tax. Finally, Mr. Speaker, all finished goods which are available in the region in sufficient quantities attract a common external tariff rate of 35%. The revised tariff bands are meant to cater for goods with long value chains which require differentiated rates to promote investments. Mr. Speaker, despite rice and wheat being among the staple foods in our countries, Kenya's production of these food items does not meet the domestic demand. In order to meet domestic demand, Kenya will import rice at a rate of 35% instead of 75% under the EAC Common External Tariff. Further, in order to ensure that there is enough wheat to meet local demand while at the same time protecting wheat farmers from unfair competition, Kenya will import wheat under East African Community Duty Remission Scheme of 10% instead of 35%. The importation of wheat will be undertaken upon recommendation of the Ministry of Agriculture, who will ensure wheat millers as a priority purchase local wheat before they are allowed to import. Mr. Speaker, in order to support local automobile industry assembly in the region, the East African Community Partner States agreed to continue with the importation of raw materials for manufacture of parts used in the assembly of motor vehicles, and especially leaf spring, radiators, and wiring harness under the duty remissions. In addition, the region agreed to extend importation of completely knocked down kits for assembly of motorcycles at 10% under the duty remission as the region awaits the finalization of the East African Community Assembly regulations. Mr. Speaker, Kenya has suffered capacity to manufacture various products in the metal and allied subsector, thus providing employment opportunities to many Kenyans, thus failing to provide employment to so many Kenyans. In order to continue safeguarding this sector, the East African Community Ministers agreed that imported iron and steel products shall continue attracting a duty rate of 35% with the corresponding specific rates for a further 1 year for Kenya. Mr. Speaker, our hard-working farmers are capable of producing enough food to satisfy domestic demand. In particular, local demand for most vegetable products has been adequately served by our farm produce over the years. To protect these farmers from cheap imports, Kenya has been allowed to extend the import duty rate of 35% in addition to the specific import duty rates on vegetable products for a further 1 year. Mr. Speaker, the high cost of inputs of animal feeds, coupled with other factors like unfavorable weather conditions, make the locally manufactured animal feeds expensive and hence contribute to food inflation. In order to promote the local manufacturing and make animal feeds affordable to farmers, Kenyans will import inputs for manufacture of animal feeds duty-free under East African Community Duty Remission Scheme for 1 year. Mr. Speaker, last year we allowed the manufacturers of baby diapers to access inputs for manufacture of baby diapers duty-free. This was meant to lower the cost of manufacturing these essential products. I'm happy to note that many companies have responded to this incentive by increasing production. In order to continue making these products affordable to our babies, the East African ministers allowed Kenya to extend the duty-free importation of inputs from manufacture of baby diapers for a further 1 year. Moreover, to protect these manufacturers from competition from imported products, the region allowed Kenya to extend charging imported baby diapers at a rate of 35% for a further 1 year. Mr. Speaker, leather industry is one of the priority value chain under the bottom-up economic transformation agenda. In order to support local value addition and protect the industry from unfair competition, the East African Community Partner States agreed to retain the import duty on imported leather and footwear products at a rate of 35%. In addition, Kenya was allowed to extend the duty-free importation of raw materials and inputs for manufacture of footwear products. Mr. Speaker, Kenya has adequate capacity to meet local demand for roofing tiles. In order to facilitate access to Kenyan-made roofing tiles at affordable prices, Kenya was granted extension of a duty-free window for importing inputs for the manufacture of roofing tiles for a further 1 year. Mr. Speaker, in order to protect the Kenyan producers of paper and paper products from the proliferation of cheap imports, Kenya was allowed to import these products at a rate of 35% for the next 1 year. Mr. Speaker, in order to protect local production of safety matches, particle boards, plywoods, among other goods of timber, Kenya was allowed to extend charging of specific rates of import duty in addition to a development duty ranging from US $120 per metric ton to US $200 per metric ton on these goods. This is also meant to curb the other valuation of goods and safeguard revenues further. Revenues. Further, Kenya was allowed to charge a rate of 45% on imported furniture in order to protect local manufacturers and producers. Mr. Speaker, Kenya has sufficient capacity to manufacture plastic and rubber products to supply both the domestic and regional markets. In order to protect local manufacturers, Kenya was allowed to impose import duty rate at 35% on these goods for 1 year instead of 25%. Mr. Speaker, in order to protect local assembly of smartphones and other mobile phones, Kenya was allowed to extend the import duty rate of 25% on smartphones and other telephones for cellular networks or other wireless networks for 1 year. Further, Kenya was allowed to extend duty-free importation of inputs for assembly of smartphones and other cellular phones. Mr. Speaker, Kenya has capacity to produce billets for manufacture of wire rods and other similar products to meet the local demand. In order to protect the local manufacturers of these goods, Kenya was allowed to charge an import duty of 10% on billets. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to tax measures proposed in the Finance Bill 2023. Let me start off with amendments to the Value Added Tax 2013. Mr. Speaker, I now embark on measures proposed under the Value Added Tax 2013. Mr. Speaker, the high cost of liquefied petroleum gas, LPG, contributes to the escalating cost of living and continued use of firewood and charcoal, which negatively affects our forest cover. In order to make LPG affordable and promote its uptake, as well as encourage the use of clean sources of energy, I am proposing to the National Assembly to zero-rate VAT on LPG. Mr. Speaker, currently, exported services are subject to VAT at the rate of 16%. This has caused an increase in the cost of exported services, hence affecting the competitiveness of our services in the global market. In order to increase competitiveness and encourage exportation of taxable services, I propose to the National Assembly to remove VAT on exported taxable services. Mr. Speaker, currently, tea purchased for local value addition, either from the factories or tea auction centers, is VATable, affecting the cash flow of the tea exporters. In order to encourage local value addition of our tea, I propose to the National Assembly to remove VAT on tea purchased from factories or tea auction centers for value addition and subsequent export. This will improve the cash flows of tea exporters involved in local value addition. Mr. Speaker, currently helicopters, airplanes, and other aircrafts are and other aircrafts of unladen weight not exceeding 2,000 kilograms are subject to VAT. Further,